Ready? Here we go.
Different points of view and highs and lows. A new perspective everywhere you go. Open up your mind, drown out the noise, and see if this connected. And see if this connected.
The mission of this Connected podcast is to connect generations and situations about faith, life, and whatever comes along the way, to not necessarily agree, but be listened to. These conversations, of course, share the different perspectives of me and my guests. You, of course, are always welcome to agree or even disagree, but as always, we hope that it is done with charity. Friends, welcome to This Connected. I'm Catholic.Dad. Actually, my name is Arnel, a former youth minister at St. Mary's, and I have wonderful guests today. Today, we are actually going to tackle an issue that is coming up, percolating in our communities, in our media, that's always been neglected, and that is the rise in Asian American racism. And with me today in my panel guests, I'm so blessed to have these two. I'm going to introduce them to you. Nicole right here, Nicole De Maguindin, is part of the core team for high school youth ministry at St. Christopher in Moreno Valley. She's been serving the church for over 6 years through Filipino Ministry, Asian Pacific Ministry, and National Ecumenical Forum for Filipino Concerns. She hopes to empower our youth to make a difference in our church and society, especially among the poor. Her goal is to welcome more Filipino youth into church life, deepen their faith, and be inspired by our commonalities with other culturally diverse Catholics. She also works for Asian Pacific Counseling and Treatment Centers as Filipino community mental promoter, doing projects such as Kapihan for Mental Wellness, Kapwa Kabataan Youth Leadership, and COVID pandemic outreach for Filipino older adults. Welcome, Nicole. And
Hello.
hello. And our next guest is Francis Abalos, who is currently a parent and family specialist and community mental health promoter for Asian Pacific Counseling and Treatment Centers. Prior to her current occupation, she used to work for California Psych Care, formerly known as Autism Response Team, as a behavior interventionist for kids with autism. She graduated with her bachelor's in psychology from University of California, Riverside last June, and currently resides in Redlands in the San Bernardino County with her family. To add to that, Nicole, I have to look here because my list cut off, but this is so important. I need to share with you guys what Nicole wants to do and continue on. Right now, she is also in her clinical psychology master's program, working on getting her license to become a marriage and family therapist so she can further provide APIs and other BIPOC with mental health services. Frances' favorite pastime are watching anime, playing video games, and dancing. Actually, I think we forgot what Nicole's favorite thing to do is. But Nicole, what was one of your favorite things that you do?
Um, I love theater. So back when we're able to go out and see shows, my favorite theater productions were Zoot Suit and Rent, and a play called M Butterfly. So.
Well, welcome to This Connected podcast. And I asked the two of you to come on because you guys work in the front lines. You guys know more about this topic than I do. You've experienced it yourselves as well as I. And I think it's important for our listeners who are youth, young adults, and their parents to hear that perspective from us. Now, someone asked me, well, why are you doing it with APIs and why didn't you do it with other groups? Well, to be honest to our listeners out there, I have not lived a life in that way. And so I'm more comfortable to share my experiences in this way, and to highlight a little bit about my experience and the experience of my community, which doesn't take away from other communities. And my hope is in our discussion in this 3-part series is that will only enhance what's happening out there, and how we can promote this thing of ridding our community with racism. So welcome to the show, guys. So now and this is that pause, because with this podcast, I always go in tangents. And what we always do is, in this 3-part series, I want to just share that we're going to talk about in this first part the things that we see. We're calling this seeing the unseen. And one of the things that we were watching videos, and what was coming up in social media was the racism, the rise in racism with Asian Americans. And that has not been highlighted, and I don't think it's been highlighted enough. I just want to ask you guys, first of all, what's your experience with racism, or what have you seen?
I can talk a little bit. So being an Asian American woman, or a Filipino woman in particular, I've faced a lot of racism that is targeted specifically.
Oh, we had a pause. So while we catch up with Nicole, because there's a little lag there. Go there. Yeah, you had a lag, but go ahead.
Oh my, is my internet doing? Is this better?
That's better.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, I don't know what happened. So the racism I experienced was very much also targeted to my gender and the stereotypes of being like an Asian woman that's supposed to be submissive, very oriental and exotic. So I've experienced going to bars and people really hounding me, what is your race? And how are you? Even a lot of stereotypes in dating that make me very, very uncomfortable. If I didn't come from a family that made sure that I was aware and strong about, standing up for myself and, not giving in and recognizing those like machismo things, things could have gone a lot worse, It's a little bit of what I faced personally.
How about you, Francis?
So for me, it's interesting because it's more subtle. I think the most like out there type of racism I experienced was when the first time or the 2016 when Donald Trump became our president. And sorry, that was my dog if you heard that, but he's crying because he wants to be let out. But anyway, so when Donald Trump became president, I wrote something on social media, obviously regarding my hatred for him, and I didn't want him to be my president. And then a Caucasian male friend, obviously not a friend anymore, but he pretty much told me to just go back to where I came from. Yeah. So that was, I mean, obviously I have very good friends and they all supported me, but that was the most outward racism I experienced. The rest of them were more subtle.
It's okay. Let him out.
Yeah.
I just have to tell you guys, one of the things we had this podcast scheduled, a couple of days ago, but my dog had a seizure, and so we had to bring it over to this time. So Polly is actually okay now. Catholic dog number 2, she's fine, and we have our animal friends. But go ahead, Francis.
Sorry, give him to my brother. Anyway, it's more subtle in that, and it happens strangely within my own like friends and family, these comments of like, oh, you're getting dark. Oh, you're getting dark. Nangingitim ka. That's what they
Yeah.
say, right? If you're out in the sun too long. And I agree with Nicole. It also pertains to my gender as well. Sometimes people think if you're Asian, you're a woman, that you're automatically like submissive, all of that, right? And it's like I said, it's pretty subtle. It's pretty subtle. You won't like notice it right away. It's so easy to just gloss over, right? And then, or maybe someone will make a comment and say, how do you say my name in your language?
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, how do you say my name in your language? Yeah, I would tell I would be, and I had this question at such a young age. I was already like, I was only like elementary, and they would ask me that, and I'd be like, it's the same, and they would be like, no, but how do you say it? And I'm like, I really don't know. I used to give them fake names just to get them to leave me alone. It's the most subtle thing that you wouldn't even think is racism, but now you look back on it and it's like, you really had no reason to ask that or like say those things. Yeah.
As an older person who grew up in the 70s and 80s, I always ask my daughters, when we moved to the location where we moved, I had to make sure that they lived in a community that was diverse. Our neighbors were a diverse group of people. Now, since then, it's changed where there's a predominance of one culture again. But when we first moved, when I looked, and it's like, oh, well, good. My neighbors are African American, they're Mexican, they're Japanese, we're Filipino. We were literally the only couple that was married to each other's culture. Everybody was biracial. And I used to tease and say, you know what? All these kids look like Filipinos. They all can be mine. So I love that neighborhood. But as you said, Francis, the racism is subtle. And I think as Filipinos, we kind of joke around with it and we laugh at it. I think that's in our nature to laugh it off. Because I remember friends in the 6th grade asking me, how do you write my name in your language? And I was like, what? And this was before I discovered Baybayin, which is a traditional writing of Filipinos that the Spanish had us forget or remove. But they would constantly hound me. And so I would make up little, characters from what I saw from the mahjong sets. And so I would make it up. And then they would ask me again because they would lose it. And they would say, hey, how come this is different? I said, well, this one is in cursive. And people would fall for it. I'm like, how stupid can they be? Or it's like, I remember as recent as 5 years ago, when a director of mine at work asked me where I was from. And it literally affected me. I thought, wow, I am old enough and people still feel this way. Mm. And he was Caucasian, very machismo type guy, comes up to me and says, hey, where are you from? And I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, where'd you grow up? And I said, North Hollywood. And he said, no, like, where did you grow up? And I'm thinking, going through, I was like, well, El Monte? Going through, it's like Roland Heights. And it says, no, like, where are you from? And I said, oh, you're asking like what country, like my family's from, my origin? He says, yeah. And I had to say, yeah, the Philippines. And literally, I kid you not, this is the words that came from his mouth. Wow, you speak English good.
Aww.
And I remember the only thing I could respond with was, actually, I speak it well.
Yes.
And walked away. And I kicked myself for the longest time for just giving that answer instead of going off, instead of going off on the guy.
Mhm.
I walked away, and I think that was a defensive mechanism that we've ended up having, is to poke fun of ourselves, be a little bit more witty, and come up with a comebacks instead of being angry and showing our anger. And do you think, I have so many stories of growing up that people say, you really experienced that, but we never talk about it. And we never talk about it. And it's kind of those things where no one really asks, but it's still here, and it still hurts, and it still remains. And do you think that as APIs, do you think that's a commonality, that of our nature, we just keep it in, and we just stay silent? We just disappear in the corner and in the shadows, and it's like, just want to be left alone.
I feel like that's maybe a survival tactic for us, like where we were fresh off the boat, now we don't want to rock the boat, like we've made so many games, whether we came here as like refugees or we came here through that long petition process, that we don't want to risk all the things that we've lost, the future that we want for our children. So maybe, we'll hold it in just a little bit, we'll be quiet for a little bit. But then it's like, it has an effect on the next generation if we don't teach them how to handle healthy confrontations, and how to stand up for yourself. Like what I was saying, when I had the same experience where I was at a punk show. I was early 20s, and then this guy was like, hey, where are you from? I was like, what? Yeah, really, where are you from? I'm like, I'm from the IE. And they're like, no, where are you from? I said, or what's your ethnicity? I'm like, I'm a US citizen. And they're like, no, like, what's on your ID? What's your last name? I'm like, I'm not gonna tell you my last name. So I kept like refusing this guy. And he's like, no, okay, I really want to know what's your race. And I said straight up, I'm not gonna tell you my race. That's not important right now, right? That's not relevant. I don't want to talk about it. But he kept pushing to the point where it's really uncomfortable, not just for me, but like the people around us. And because it got so heated, they kind of kicked him out.
Good.
But if I feel like if at that moment I gave him just like, whatever, let him have it. Let's just move on. Like, I don't know. He wouldn't have gotten kicked out. He probably would have kept, hitting on me or like the next yellow fever victim out there, right?
Yeah. Now these are, as you're saying, and as Francis said, these are all subtle. These are all subtle things. And I remember at Pomona Valley Hospital, I remember my aunt, who was written up for speaking her own language. And I remember they made a policy that you could not speak Tagalog at work. That was a policy. That was a written policy. This was in the 90s. You could not speak Tagalog because someone complained. I can't understand them. They're at lunch. You shouldn't have to understand me. Doesn't matter, right? And then there's so many subtle ways of racism that we kind of ignore as a community, but it happens and it affects us. And then for me, I find it sometimes with parents and family, then it's a self-blame. I mean, what did you do? I remember when my aunt said that and she was so upset. Family said, well, you should be speaking English. You're in America. And I'm like, wait, it just doesn't sound right. But we kind of go along with the, we don't want to rock the boat. Just, we're lucky to be on the boat.
Even the language too. I asked my parents a lot, why didn't you teach me English? And why don't you, a lot of Filipinos who grew up here, why didn't we learn Filipino? And it was, my parents felt pressured in that subtle way by the school district that, oh, if you don't have them completely English. If they're bilingual, they'll be in like a remedial ESL class. It's not beneficial for them. So
Mhm.
yeah, and that was in the 90s too. I don't know. Did you have something similar in your school district, Francis, where it's like if you're ESL, that meant you were in a certain tier of education?
I guess I don't know, but I can relate. What I can relate to is the no Tagalog at school because I went to a private school. And well, granted, like when I met another Filipino kid like me, they didn't speak Tagalog. This was when I migrated at 6 years old. And I would make fun. We would make fun of each other. And it got to the point where even parents got involved and they told us, okay, you can't speak Tagalog during school. And like, because it was my first time getting in trouble, I felt so ashamed. I never did it. You know, it was stored in the back of my memory until Arnel, you brought that up, and I was like, oh, that happened to me too. They told us not to speak Tagalog anymore because they couldn't understand it. They didn't know what we were saying. Might have been bad.
Yeah.
This kid.
That's how languages die out, like when the mother tongue in schools isn't like encouraged among diverse populations, like that's very unnerving, even though it's subtle and it affects the young generation, but like it has this huge ripple effect, and we can feel it nowadays, like
It's a painful past. I remember my mom being told by the school that they need to learn English because there's no ESL for Filipinos. And so I was literally given the most talkative student to just talk to me. And that kid just was just so talkative that I think that's the reason why I learned it so fast, was I just wanted him to leave me alone. His name is Scott. So Scott, if you're ever listening to this, thank you, brother. Um, but yeah, my mom was pressured in saying, you have to speak English only. And we did. We spoke English only in the home. My mom had a really difficult time with it. And then once we did, my mom changed the rules. And she said, okay, inside the house, we only speak Tagalog. Outside the house, and here's the thing, but outside the house, we only speak English. And so it was like, okay, so in front of other people everywhere outside, we just had to speak English. And it was almost, for the longest time, a shaming of my own culture. I grew up in predominantly white neighborhoods that you had to try to fit in, but you were never going. It's almost like the Filipino thing of, you're trying to be white, but you'll never be white. You're trying to fit into a community that will never probably accept you because you'll never be white. And it's either one, you're either, the whole thing that I was going through in my life was, my mom wants us in a better neighborhood, white neighborhood. So she wants you to be as American. And in Filipino, what is American? They're white, because black people aren't American. They're itim. They're black. Mexican people who are Mexican, American, they're not American. They're Mexican. But white person, doesn't matter if they're from Canada, if they're from England, if they're from France, they're American because they're white. And so for me, my experience was that trying to be white, but never going to be white, and accepting that, or being a person of color, and that's something that we are like, then I'm a minority, or forever being considered a foreigner. I mean, the options were like, okay, well, what do I be? And I don't think I was ever raised thinking that I could be a Filipino. and be proud of it.
Mhm.
So that's my experience. Now, with the recent events that are going on, the reason why I asked you guys, because you guys are in the front lines. You guys are younger than me. You see this on a daily basis in your line of work. Now, what are some recent events that have happened that's affected kind of this wake up uh, amongst even Asians, the Asian community that says, hey, that's giving us a voice to speak up? Because I'm telling you, growing up, I never heard of it, of people protesting with the racism against Asian Americans, and that whole thing, and speak to us a little bit about being the model minority and what's happening out there to this model minority. What are the things that are happening? And Francis, you can speak to that with the rise in the increase, and what you feel is the reason for that rise. Speak boldly about that.
Some of the things that we've seen that have been happening in our community, recent and even not recent, but now getting attention, are Asian elders being abused, being harassed, pushed down. In Northern California, and I think, was it Pasadena or Pomona? Such a letter P. So that's one of them. And then another one that I just saw very, very recently, at least recently, to gain more attention within my circle of friends and what I've seen on my own social media, is a Filipino young adult, Angelo Quinto, who was he died because of police brutality. He was going through a mental health crisis, and the response to his crisis killed him. Another one, and he wasn't the only one who died during a mental health crisis. There was another one. I think his name is Christian Hall. Correct me if I'm wrong, Christian. He was also going through a mental health crisis, and the response to him killed him. Very, very unfortunate. And unfortunately, these are not there. These happenings, this pattern of the wrong response to our community and violent crimes towards our community, they're not new. They're definitely not new, but they haven't gotten as much attention as they should. And I think it does go back to what you said earlier, Arnel, which is we're the type of people to want to kind of power through something, right? Power through something. If that means, laughing it off, finding something that to remain optimistic by, to get us by, sometimes that's what we'll do, right? And I think that contributes to why, for the most part, a lot of things that do happen to us, we might not know about or might not get the attention that it needs.
Because we don't speak up.
I think also just the timing of everything, not just within the community, but external factors too contributed to why this spike and the spike in cases and the spike in popularity. So not only is around February to March, January, the season for Lunar New Year, it's also around the anniversary of when the COVID pandemic was really, cases were rising. So for me, I'm like, okay, maybe there's a lot of trauma, chronic trauma around that anniversary that's triggered in folks who aren't having the life that they thought would be back to normal by this time. And there's no other scapegoat historically, right? Ethnic minorities are a scapegoat for a lot of things. Just to name drop, right? The Japanese internment camps from World War II. Right? We're not, that's nothing new. And then also around February is Black History Month. So then it's kind of like this thing of how can we honor Black history and Black Lives Matter sort of things, but then at the same time, API lives matter because our elders are dying, right? They are being violently attacked. So Francis mentioned the case up in San Francisco or the Bay Area where a Thai elder was pushed to the ground, and because of his injuries, he died. There is also a Filipino man in New York where he was slashed from ear to ear on the subway in the daytime, and almost nobody came to help, right? So these attacks are not only happening, there's also calls for just how can we defend our communities and elders? Then at the same time, what can we do as bystanders, people who are observing or seeing these atrocities happen, right? This is a big reason why this is such a wake-up call is, the vulnerable are in need and are getting affected. And there are just so many commonalities too, right? So when elders are attacked in other ethnic diverse communities, those are the keepers of knowledge, the keepers of culture and history. So it's like a low blow if you think about it. And then when Francis mentioned the case of Angelo Quinto, that's also draws a lot of parallels between, it's not just our community that's facing the wrong response from police brutality. And at the same time, right, as people are saying, we need to defend our elders, who do we turn to? There are mixed opinions on, do we need more policing? And then there's the camp of, no, we do not need more policing. We need better alternatives. So it can be this very conflicted sort of conversation around what safety looks like. What does standing up to racism look like? What does it look like to finally hear from the model minority that we need support, and we need to harness our power.
And what's interesting there is, I think because of the things that have been going on, heightened awareness allows us, and we need to give thanks for the people who are fighting the front, because that heightened awareness allows people to see this and say, hey, how come it's not being spoken of? How come it's not being shared? That there are other people who are affected with racism. Just because we're quiet doesn't mean that it's not happening. Someone asked me one time when I was a kid why I always had my head down. I could, growing up in middle school, I could tell you how many lines on the sidewalk it was all the way to the school was 313. And the reason for that is I counted. And the reason why I had my head down was that means I didn't have to have eye contact with anyone who would make fun of me because of my culture, because of my features. And that was just a defense mechanism. And some people say, okay, why do Asians walk with their head down? Well, culturally, sometimes we're not supposed to make eye contact. But maybe just like me growing up, it was so that I don't have to see that. The whole joke, this subtle racism, this joke of Asians who are bad drivers. You guys don't know this. They'll cut you off and they'll never look at you. They'll just ignore you, avoid confrontation. Asians are no, well, just avoid confrontation. I don't see you. So it didn't happen. That's because we've been scapegoated for so long that we're just going to avoid that. We're just going to leave our way and keep driving away. So you'll just leave us alone. So I have some questions from patrons and listeners, and either of you can answer to this. And one of the questions is, where do you see racism the most?
America. Just kidding.
I mean, do you experience
Oh
it more in
wow,
the
that's such
workplace, in the public square? I mean, here's the choices that I was looking at that. Do you
that song
experience it
comes to my mind. This is America, right? Just kidding.
right?
um oh man,
I mean, do
like
you
there's so
experience
many
it
ways
more?
that
Do you experience it more in the workplace, in the public square, um, even among friends? You know, where do you see it the most? Where do you see racism the most?
so I'm very into like social justice, social concerns. I've gone to like the Stations of the Cross at Adelanto, right? Things like that, where it makes a difference when people of faith are in the front lines, especially on immigration issues. And so I've experienced the harshest moments of racism when you're at those a lot of rallies, when you're at actions to defend undocumented migrants. Like the tension is just you're sweating because you know that the other side, the those who are anti-immigrant, those who don't empathize or understand our experience, they're they're packing.
Yeah,
They're packing and they're concealing, and you're just there like
yeah,
right. Oh, we're praying. Oh, we're doing our nonviolent, our peaceful tactics. We're standing here. We're trying to create sanctuary for those who are most vulnerable, those families. We're trying to give a voice to the voiceless, and that is where racism, for me, I feel it the most, and in its most like raw and um, blatant and angry form. I don't know if you remember, but there was a 4th of July back in like 2000 something, 2015, 14, where there is this bus of Central American migrant children that was supposed to come to the Inland
Temecula.
Empire. Yeah,
Mhm.
and I was there, and I remember I held a sign that said, Filipino youth stand in solidarity with Central American migrant children. And somebody spat on me and said, "How dare you say that?" I'm like, oh my goodness. It's just a sign. you know, um, it's very raw
Yeah. How about
and
you,
very
Francis?
explicit, not subtle. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking of I was actually thinking the opposite. I was thinking of where might I see it the least. And I want to say like it'll still happen there, but higher education institutions, obviously there will still be racism there, but I think where you would see it the least might be higher education institutions, because this is where people gather and actually take the time to learn about, not just about, their chosen field, their chosen career, but of other cultures too. Um, and when we think of that, it makes sense that maybe the opposite of that might be where we might see the most racism. Somewhere where people are people thrive on being ignorant and being closed off. Um, somewhere that there's not much diversity, you know, in that sort of place. Um, and people aren't open to meeting people that are diverse.
I definitely agree. So there's this thing called ethnic studies, and uh, just imagine if those concepts of ethnic studies were not only brought from these places of academia where a lot of the theories are created, but what if it was brought down to the K through 12? What if it was
Mhm.
brought to the Catholic private schools. How would that change the way that our Catholic education is going, the ministry, religious ed, right? So there's that. And then how is it if this was also in the community college level, or in the ways that we teach about theology and things like that, right? I'm from St. Christopher, and we are the Reconciling a Multicultural Church. So it's a very gentle way to welcome people into that conversation. And it is, someday my hope, what if it's no longer, or we're opening spaces to transform the conversation where it's not just talking about being multicultural, but how can we be anti-racist and not be afraid of calling it anti-racist work. And of course, that does take a lot of education, like Francis was saying. So, yeah.
Yeah, and going back, and we're going to talk about this in our second episode, in the historicity of it all. But the fight for ethnic studies in the University of San Francisco, a few of our Filipino leaders fought for that, and ensure that it would be available. And we need to give a shout out to them. But there's something that always troubled me, even when I look at the videos, and in preparation for this series with the two of you, I watched many videos on Twitter, on YouTube, regarding all those attacks on Asian Americans. And what I saw was a little bit disturbing for me. And I don't know if it was disturbing for you, not because of the violence, but for me, the things that were being highlighted kind of takes me back to the way that the Mexicans and the Filipinos were separated during the farm labor movement. It kind of like putting them against each other. And to me, the videos that were being highlighted were a lot of attacks by people of color against Asian Americans. And I think for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it kind of fosters already this racism that's among API towards other people of color. I have to admit that, as an Asian, as a Filipino, very racist towards other people of color. I mean, you got to be honest. You got to call it like it is. We have names. I mean, when we go back on this episode, hopefully you guys come back to listen to the next episode when we talk about our own personal historicity and our our part and how we became that way. So do you see a pattern there? Is it just me that's seeing that?
Yes, I do see a pattern. And that pattern feeds who gets to be at the top. It really does. Because this is kind of why the racism towards us is more subtle, and why, we're considered quiet, submissive, model minority. we would never actively seek out, who's playing the cards. Rather, we're trying to pit the blame on other marginalized folks, because it's so much easier to do that, right? I agree with you. We see these videos and automatically we think, get your own member. check your own members. But it's like, what happened for them to blame us? First of all, who has been perpetuating Asian violence and these stereotypes? Who has been calling COVID-19 Kung Flu? Who has been calling COVID-19 China virus? Can we think about that first? And, and then we can address why people get scared of us. You know what I mean? Because we start to shoot the messenger, but then we don't ever really get to who sent that messenger. Right?
I
Yeah.
totally agree. So this concept of like divide and conquer tactics that are, you can say are beneficial to a certain group, a historically certain group, right? It makes its subtle way through um, what is dominant, what we see a lot in the media, and what is not seen in the media, what is downplayed, or what does not gain popularity, right? So uh, for me, when I saw that, oh my, these are people of color against people of color, this is very beneficial to the narrative of divide and conquer. That is not what we need right now. That is very counterintuitive to like this need for just peace and harmony in a time of a pandemic. So it was very unsettling to see like, oh man, we need a strong counter narrative to this. We need, how can we make that side more popular? And it just intersects with a lot of issues too around what does safety look like, who is the good, who is the bad minority, when in the end it shouldn't even be that conversation.
Mhm.
Right, we are all God's children.
Right.
you know
It's definitely hard to see. It's definitely hard even to talk about as you know, as a person of faith, uh, and looking at things, social justice and loving thy neighbor. Um, there are times where you're serving and you see this and it's like, well, who's loving me? Um, I'm serving everybody else, every single culture. But what about me? What about me? Um, and so, what I always had hoped is in growing up, and being picked on, um, was was how come nobody came up to to defend me? Uh, how come nobody said anything and said, "Hey, stop that"? Um, and so in the sixth grade, you form little cliques of protection. And because, we grew up in a predominantly white area, um, I still had the four friends, two Koreans and two black kids and one Filipino guy. Um, we were the basketball team, uh, because we were good. But it's like you were separated, um, not because initially you liked each other, but because you were the people who are on the outside. You know, you are not the ones who are welcomed. And I think, in a way, when things like this happen, it makes me feel like we're still on the outside, even though so-called we're that model minority, still on the outside, trying to come back in. We're trying to have a seat at the table because, as a Filipino, even in community forums, even in politics, um, with being the second largest Asian group in California in the United States, um, we're so underrepresented, aren't we? Um, I mean, can you name one Filipino senator? Can you name one Filipino representative? Can you name one Filipino mayor? Like,
yeah, and Cerritos, I think there's one Filipino politician out in the Cerritos area. But see,
yeah,
it's hard for me
but
to recall the name. I just know Cerritos Filipino politics.
but he shares that. I mean, Cerritos has a rotating mayor that they share it. It's not even totally his. I'm just kidding. I too forgot his name.
And then
But
we have a local Asian American, I think, mayor or local government out in, say, East Vale. I believe it's East Vale or Harupa Valley. We have Mark Takano, who's Japanese American. Very few.
so here's the thing. I'd like the two of you to share what it is that you're doing now, because I want you to share it all throughout our 3 series and maybe even more. because right now, I mean, this is a little rough on the edge, because we're trying to speak about something that is so sensitive, and you know, as my mom said, you know, you can forgive, but the scar is always going to be there. We're opening up some scars and some wounds that are difficult for us to speak of. And this doesn't, you know, for me, this doesn't take away from the wounds, the bigger, the heavier wounds of other people of color. But I think this needs to be heard. That there are also wounds in API communities that we don't like to speak of, because you know, we you know, as my mom would say, you know, in her accent, what's that going to do? Just move on. I'm like, Mom, yeah, move on. Yeah, make a life better for yourself. You know, stop complaining. Yeah. What's complaining gonna do for you? Nothing. I was like, okay, Mom, whatever. Says, go to school, get an education. Yeah. And that was my mom's answer to everything. But tell us, what is it that you guys do? Nicole, what is it that you do so that actually there was a question from one of the young adults about what is API, and what resources are there that's available for, after I told what API was for Asian Pacific, for API communities and members, that because she actually has people in her church and she'd like to be able to provide those resources. So what is it that you guys do? Nicole, why don't you go first?
Ooh, okay, so we're thinking about resources for API. We're on this faith-based podcast. And then I'm primarily repping right now St. Christopher Youth Ministry. Woo woo. You can follow us on Instagram at
Val.
Young Catholics. And then we have a bunch of like events coming up to, like a movie night and a hiking thing. So you can keep in touch with us that way. I would love to give a big shout out to Sister Jennifer out at the Asian Pacific Ministry. She does amazing work bridging not just, you know, Filipino ministry, Chinese, Indonesian, but also like the Tongan ministries out there too, for all my Tongan friends. What else? Yeah. So if you go to just API Asian Pacific Ministry, you'll see all the different ethnic ministries there and who you can contact to get involved. And then if you are in need of like mental health resources, I'll let Francis handle that one. Else, if you're on a college campus, depending on where you're at. So for example, at UC Riverside, it's there's a heavy Asian population. So that means their Catholic Student Fellowship also has a lot of API influence. They're a good resource. Father Alwyn at the St. Andrew Newman Center. Sorry, I'm just like dumping all these names.
Good, that's good stuff.
Who else? Other API resources. Faith-based National Ecumenical Forum for Filipino Concerns. That's a really big plug if you want to know more about like social justice, social concerns. What is it like to work with our brothers and sisters from the Methodist Church, from the UCC, right? Connecting back to the homeland. They're really great. Student Christian Movement of the Philippines. Those are the homies in the homeland too. And of course, if you are in a situation where
we lost her again.
Report. Hello. So I'm gonna give this website. It's called stopapihate.org. That is where you can go to submit a report on what has happened to you or a loved one. And so that data can continue to grow and be used as leverage and an advocacy point for our community. There's also lots of resources on anti-API bullying, etc. Yeah. And then I'll toss it to Francis, who can talk about mental health stuff.
Yes, because Nicole and I do work together as community mental health promoters. for APCTC, which stands for Asian Pacific Counseling and Treatment Centers. We're a nonprofit. We provide mental health services to those who have Medi-Cal, IHP as insurance. And we even provide it in different languages as well, from youth to older adults. And we also are able to link people to other resources that will benefit them, whether it's supplementary mental health resources like, say, yoga, or Zumba classes, things like that. We're able to do that. And Nicole and I actually, what Nicole and I do is we provide basic mental health education to public, specifically APIs in Riverside, to destigmatize mental health, encourage and promote well-being, and promoting self-care to APIs in Riverside community. Because bottom line is, the things that we've experienced regarding violence towards Asians and mental health, they are interwoven. And these are events that can cause trauma, right? So Nicole and I are part of this force that seek to provide mental health awareness, mental health education, and even linkage to services to those who experience, some trauma from maybe their personal experiences with racism and violence, or they've seen it with their friends, their family, even online. So that's something that we are qualified to do for those who want to reach out to us and want to be given basic mental health education. It's fully funded by Riverside County, so it's no cost to anyone. And not only can we provide this mental health education, we have a lot of knowledge on other resources such as NAMI or Each Mind Matters, things like that can help people who might be going through crises, who might need help with housing, things like that.
So you said this is funded by the Riverside County. Does that mean that you have to be a resident of Riverside County to gain assistance?
So our targets are
if you go to a church, or if you go to school in Riverside County, if you frequent Riverside County, you can avail of our services.
No questions asked. So wherever you are, if you're hearing this and you need these services, you can go. We'll put all the information that was just shared, I know was a lot, in the description. We'll add the links to it so that you guys can click on it, easily available to you. So I know Nicole and Francis shared a lot of information that needs to be out there regarding resources. So we're going to make sure that that all gets put on the link. Now, folks, this kind of is is a three-part series. So if you're wondering why is it so that we didn't even share a lot about what Francis and Nicole are doing, or what going deeper into the history of API racism, well, we're doing this as a three-part series. So make this kind of like your Lenten thing going. So we're going to release 3 of these once every single month, so that it allows you to saturate into you. And so our next episode of this podcast is we're going to talk about the history of racism or anti-API hatred in California against the Filipino communities and all API communities, and where that lies today, in the past, and how that kind of started, so we can actually understand where we came from. And so, as my mom would say, her famous words in Tagalog, well, actually, that's hard for me. In English, a person who does not know where they came from will never get to where they're going. So in order for us to get to where we're gonna be, We need to learn what happened in the past. So in our next episode, we're going to talk about the historicity of it all. And in our third episode, that's where the nitty-gritty happens. That's when Francis and Nicole totally take over, because they're going to tell you about action plans and how we're going to do this and what we're going to be doing, and what we can work on, and how to be an ally to as other people of color, and what is our role. What is your role, what youth role is, and what young adults can do, and what our parents can do to become part of the solution and not part of the lingering problem of racism in our communities, in our country, and the entire world, and our church. We need to accept that is prevalent also in our church. So, Francis, Nicole, do you have any parting words?
Thank you, Arnel, for having us. It means a lot that you thought of us to help share about, what we've seen regarding what's been happening in our API community, and trusting us to talk about it and to basically let our community know that we're here for each other, right?
Yeah, again, thank you, Arnel, and then thank you to everybody involved in this podcast, everybody and anybody listening in. That's really great too. And just remember that this topic may be heavy, but it's necessary, and just take the time to find peace.
Yes, and definitely we need to give a shout out and give big, huge thanks to the Filipino Ministry of the Diocese of San Bernardino for putting us and getting us together to actually encourage us to actually tackle this discussion. I know we've had long talks on how to do this, on what we need to share, and hopefully this collaboration with the Filipino Ministry of the Diocese of San Bernardino will actually encourage more young people from our community to get involved, to be a part of the solution, and not just linger, and allow our other friends and our peers to walk the front, and let's join them and let's be part of the solution, as I always say. So thank you to the two of you. Before I start stuttering, I just want to say thank you again. I'll see you in a little bit so we can record the second part of this. But to you guys, fam, who are listening, that's all we have for this episode. We definitely hope this connected, and as usually, we pray that you discern the things that you've heard and put it to heart and put it to action. If it didn't connect with you, please, and if you have any comments, please send us an email at catholic.dad50@gmail.com. If you have questions for our future episodes, please, again, send it to our email. We'll definitely discuss it and make it part of the conversation. We ask you to please subscribe to the podcast on any of the many podcast platforms so we can get the message out there. Give us a review. It helps with algorithms. And yes, if you want to donate and be a patron to our podcast, it's all in the links in the description and in the bio on our Instagram. It helps support our mission to help the needs of youth and strengthen their faith, etc. I can go on forever with regards to that. So it all goes for a good cause. And as usual, I want to tell you guys, I want to ask you guys to remember to live a life of holiness. We'll be praying for you. Please pray for us. And most importantly, be blessed and be third. See you again next time. Here we go.
Different points of view and highs and lows. A new perspective everywhere you go. Open up your mind, drown out the noise, and see if this connected. And see if